Hey, hi, hello, all you wonderful people. Today, instead of one of our normal Tuesday episodes, we're actually having a fun little conversation episode. I say fun. It's not fun. Well, it is fun. It's interesting. Today, Liv spoke with Curtis Dozier about his new book, The White Pedestal, how white nationalists use the classics to fuck shit up. Can you tell I don't have the book in front of me? Sorry. This is an important topic. I think we can all understand why, and it's amazing it's coming out on, January 6th of all days. But this is something I think we talk about a lot on the show, but not in quite so much detail, not with somebody who has spent so much time with it. And it's really important. And I find, a lot of the criticism we get is, if you care so much about this stuff, why are you criticizing it? Why are you pointing out, or saying that, this is assault, or look how shitty and terrible these men are, and why aren't you in love with all of it? Well, here's the thing, everyone. When you love something, that's the thing you should be the most critical of. When you love a topic such as classics, or any topic really, those are the things you need to be critical of and mindful of, and to pay attention to the way that they are being used and perceived by the wider public, or by specific small groups, hate groups that are getting bigger and bigger as the days go by. And I love this topic so much, I think we can all agree on that. And it makes me so unbelievably angry to see these absolute cowards using it to justify their goddamn bullshit. It's exhausting. It is tiring. I don't want to deal with it, but yet we have to. So I think it is our duty to pay attention to the way of the things that we care about are used by others, whether that is, classics being used by white supremacists to justify their absolute bigotry and bullshit, or indigenous land claims and indigenous treaty rights being used by certain groups around the world to justify their genocidal bullshit. We are allowed to be angry about these things. We are allowed to critique them. We are allowed to point out the backwards standards of it all. And that's why I'm really excited about this book, because I think it just opens the doors for us a bit more. This is not easy work. It's not stuff we want to be reading about. But I think it is important to understand how other people are perceiving things, so that you can be better prepared when you meet them. Anyways, that's all I have to say. That was heavy. Sorry. Enjoy the conversation with Liv and Curtis Dozier. Bye. Conversations. White ain't white. How white supremacy used classics to defend bigotry, with Dr. Curtis Dozier.
Your book is so aptly titled, and I was kind of thinking about how we'd start this conversation, because white supremacists using ancient Greece and Rome is something I've definitely talked about before. We've covered Sparta and everything, but I'm so curious, how did you go about this topic? What were you kind of exploring specifically? I don't know, we'll go into detail and everything, but maybe how did you get into this very timely, very important, and problematic as hell topic?
I got into studying white nationalism and classics without really knowing what I was getting into. In the kind of mid 2010s, 2016 is when it really started getting going. Classical scholars were noticing that the resurgent white nationalist movements in this country. That was a time when I think a lot of white Americans, at least, were realizing that white nationalist activism was alive and well in this country. Classical scholars were noticing that these movements were fascinated by ancient Greece and Rome. And I teach at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York, and we have, as part of our curriculum here, a focus on what we call classical reception, familiar probably to many of your listeners. But if it's not, it's kind of the study of how ancient Greece and Rome are used by different groups of people and in different time periods outside of antiquity. So we had a focus on that in our curriculum. I'd been teaching a lot of classical reception. And I think I recognized in white nationalist classicism, oh, this is an example of classical reception. Here we have, overt white supremacists using Greco-Roman antiquity to claim that racist politics are not only respectable, but desirable, even natural, certainly traditional. And so I recognized that as an example of reception, and I thought, oh, at that time I was looking for a project, and I thought, well, maybe I can work on this. And so with the advice of Donna Zuckerberg, who was a kind of pioneer in researching this phenomenon, I launched a website, Pharos, Doing Justice to the Classics, which you can find online at doingjusticetotheclassics.org. or pharosclassics.org. I started documenting examples of hate groups using ancient Greece and Rome online. I launched that in 2017, and it's been going for about 8 years now. And it forms the kind of the basis of the work that then I synthesized into my book, The White Pedestal. And when I started doing that work, I thought, what could these people possibly know about ancient Greece and Rome? I thought I was going to find gross distortions and misrepresentations of Greco-Roman antiquity, of ancient sources, of ancient political thought. And I did find a lot of those. And I thought my job as a scholar was to fight white supremacy by pointing out the inaccuracies in the ways that hate groups were using ancient Greece and Rome. And there are a lot of inaccuracies and superficial elements and even outright fabrications that you can find in chat rooms and on certain blogs and on social media and so on. There's a lot of things that could be corrected. But the more I worked on this material and the more I became familiar with the online ecosystem in which white nationalist activists move and share ideas, the more I realized that there's a subset of people working in this space who know a lot about ancient Greece and Rome, who are very familiar with ancient sources, have done the research to learn about the existence of ancient sources that, without modification, without distortion, articulate ideas, in some cases maybe congenial to white nationalist thought, in some cases identical to ideas that modern white nationalists would want to promote. And the book, The White Pedestal, is kind of my invitation to readers, classical scholars, and I hope members of the public, to kind of go on a similar journey from a point of assuming that white supremacists must be distorting history to realizing that, in fact, there is a lot of material from the ancient world that suits white nationalist politics very well. And with that realization, to think about what does that mean about the way we think about history, the way we value history, and ultimately, what does it mean about American culture writ large? Because this is a country in which white nationalists aren't the only people invoking ancient Greece and Rome all the time. This is a culture this is a society, a country, whatever you want to call it, in which ancient Greece and Rome is constantly and pervasively invoked for a whole range of ideas. And I kind of have this feeling that studying this kind of niche topic, how do white nationalists use ancient Greece and Rome, can help us see what's really going on in our larger national obsession with ancient Greece and Rome.
Yeah. Okay, it's interesting that you're going at it like sort of from that specific perspective of them doing these readings kind of accurately. And I think maybe it says something about like the circles I have on this show are just generally where my interest lies, but I'm like, oh, I this is something I think about like all the time. And I'm, I have had a lot of guests on to talk about the ways in which white nationalists and just alt-right terrible people in general, use these things. But it's I think good to remember that by and large, that's not the mentality that most people have still. Like there is still this idea that they're just kind of getting it wrong, and it's just sort of like this silly part of this otherwise horrible ideology. But I mean, it is so deep, and they use classics in so many different ways. I don't know. This is something I think about just constantly. So I'm trying to form like a real specific thought about it. But it's I'm actually, I should say too, I am Canadian if you weren't aware of that. So I'm not, I'm very much looking at where we are, the sibling that's just sort of following a few years behind in all of these things. So we have all the same, issues, just smaller and earlier, I think, in the stages. But it's been something to watch, from both countries, to see the ways in which these symbols at minimum are used.
Yeah, and we can see what happens with Canada. I hope you go a different way than we have. But I think
so do I.
In 2015 and 2016, like, I mean, we're now doing this in 2025, right? We got to think back to 2015 and 2016, right? Obama's been president for 8 years. That's a big thing. I don't know. There's just so much we didn't know. I think this did look silly. It did look ridiculous. But in 2025, we can see that using the ancient world to give prestige, to give respectability to white supremacist ideas, and just the overall neo-fascist project of making neo-fascism respectable and desirable, we can see that it works. Because in 2025, we have the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, tweeting to millions of followers material from the ancient world to support xenophobia and other reactionary politics. We have a Speaker of the House, in the third in line to the president, Mike Johnson, who in an interview has said that homosexuality destroyed the Roman Empire.
Jesus.
We have Stephen Miller. He's the the architect of the president's, you can't even call it an immigration policy, but his like targeted harassment and violence towards immigrants in this country. We have Stephen Miller at Charlie Kirk's funeral. He, as part of his speech there, invoked Athens and Rome as the ancestors of his movement. And,
oh my God.
And we have President Trump, who doesn't say that much about Greco-Roman antiquity, but he signed all these executive orders about classical architecture, mandating classical architecture as the preferred architectural style. And he just knocked down a third of the White House, one of the most symbolically important buildings in America. He just knocked down the east wing of it and is rebuilding there, if you look at the plans, a classical temple. So what in 20... I agree with you. In 2025, I don't know if there's anybody who's like, oh yeah, this is silly. But
no, I more just mean that like it still has this level of like respectability as well. Like obviously, yeah. I mean, I agree there is still respectability. This is my whole career too. But like, I think there are still these people that keep their head in the sand a little bit about those connections. In the way that it's like, oh well, it's they're just misreading or bastardizing the classics kind of thing. But yeah, no, certainly not silly now.
And I get it. Like a lot of people don't like to think about it. And that's one thing I've been trying to do with my site, since I launched it in 2017. And one thing I'm trying to do with my book is invite people to try to take it seriously.
Yeah.
and see
Well,
what they learn actually about themselves, the way I have, by taking it seriously.
mm-hmm. Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I'm curious to get into the specifics of sort of what you've been looking at. I'm curious about as you were describing it, it just kept making me think about the ways in which, and certainly, connecting back to Donna Zuckerberg of all people as well, like the ways in which this has also been going on in the same ways, if not longer, in like the misogynist specific spaces, and the ways, I think about Ovid's Ars Amatoria and the ways that that's used by pickup culture or this like incel culture, all of these horrifying things that are obviously also tied to white nationalism, to just generally these alt-right ideas. Like, have you looked at that side of it much, or just the ways that those things are connected? It's just all I kept thinking about is that the way it's also so deep in that space.
So when I launched Pharos, the site, we have documented a lot of misogyny on that site, and a lot of the material kind of in the same realm that Donna Zuckerberg wrote her book about. There's a 2018 book called Not All Dead White Men. I commend it to your readers. It's a great and pioneering book about the kinds of things I'm talking about. One thing that I find interesting, though, about the white nationalist communities that I'm interested in, the activists that I'm interested in, again, returning this idea of making their ideas respectable and desirable, seem respectable and desirable. And they're using antiquity because it is a respected and admired period of history. So if they can find something in antiquity that fits with what they believe we should be doing, they invoke that, so that people who admire antiquity will be like, oh, maybe we should take this serious, or maybe it's worth a thought, right? What they're saying. So this respectability is more important to them than anything else. And this is like what's so scary about the people that I write about, is that they're very smart politically. Like, they understand that the swastika is doing us no favors as a movement. Like that symbol does not recruit well. They understand. Scholars often ask me, what do they say about ancient slavery? Well, they don't say a ton about ancient slavery, because they understand that enslavement is a non-starter in the 21st century. Like, that's not gonna draw adherents advocating the enslavement. They might actually think, maybe enslavement would be good for white people, and I'm sure they believe that some groups of people are inferior and maybe worthy of enslavement, but they don't say a lot about ancient enslavement, because they understand that's not gonna get them anywhere. And similarly, you don't find a ton of misogyny of the kind that you find in the pickup artist sphere or the incel sphere, where there's like really open hatred of women and description of them as duplicitous and irrational and evil, and just all the like vilifying of women. Because I think if you look at the history of white nationalist movements, there've been a lot of women involved in them.
Oh, of course. I think what I'm coming at it is this, like, because what I see in all of the people you named earlier, for instance, Mike Johnson and Stephen Miller and all of these people, is I also see the ways in which wives are being utilized and the ways in which marriage is being utilized. They're afraid of single women. That's what I mean. Like, that's the misogyny too, right? That's just in the same, it's so alive. And I mean, the Charlie Kirk of it all, and now Erica Kirk is really amplifying all of those things. And so
the way you see it is in a kind of like more like an anti-feminism, I would say, than which is of course a form of misogyny. I don't want to minimize that, but one of the first things I wrote on Pharos was from a basically pickup artist site, a post about, or I wrote about a post on a pickup artist site about how feminism caused the fall of the Roman Empire. And this was very early in the project. Before. I was like, I was really just documenting, not analyzing very much. So I just threw that out there. And I remember people were like, groaning, outraged, laughing. Can you believe the ridiculous stuff here? But then, I returned to some of those ideas later when I was working on the book, and I was kind of like, where does this even come from? And you start looking at the ancient historians like Sallust, like Juvenal, and you find them talking about how women in Rome getting more freedom, having more civic rights, was corrosive, they claim, to the stability of the Roman Republic. And you find complaints about women not having enough children and how that's like weakened. These are in authentic ancient sources.
Yeah, and it's the same stuff they say today.
You find all those things. It's the same stuff they say today. Yeah. And then you start looking into, well, like, how do people know what the ancient sources say? And I started reading the Cambridge Ancient History. This is a monumental, very significant kind of survey of ancient history. It's now in its third edition for many volumes. But if you look at the first edition from the early 20th century, they basically accept the claims of the ancient historians that women having fewer babies and having more sexual freedom and being able to own property and all those things weakened the aristocracy of Rome and led to civilizational decline. So here in I don't know how you could name a more authoritative reference work than the Cambridge Ancient History. They're basically repeating the claims of these ancient historians. And then those make their way into any popular writer who consults the Cambridge Ancient History, including Will and Ariel Durant, who wrote this big 12-volume story of civilization. They won a Pulitzer Prize for their volume on the Enlightenment. It's been translated into, 25 languages, millions and millions of copies sold. I don't know if anyone nowadays still... Well, actually, I'll say something about that. It's not as popular as it once was, but like when I was a kid, you used to go over to bourgeois houses like I grew up around, and they've got copies of that around, and they use the Cambridge Ancient History. And so they, in this very popular work, are repeating these claims about the fall of the Roman Empire being connected to women's sexual freedom and so on. And fast forward to Phyllis Schlafly and the Equal Rights Amendment in the United States. This is in the 70s, but this is a woman who more than anyone else opposed a constitutional amendment that would enshrine in our Constitution equal rights for women, and she opposed it, and she made the argument that the modern feminist is like the Roman matron who destroyed the Roman Empire. And then finally, Elon Musk is telling people you should read Will and Ariel Durant if you want to know about Roman history. So, these ideas, they persist.
Yeah. That's why I was curious if you looked at them in any way in the book, because it is something that's like so... Yeah, it just keeps going, endless, these ideas.
Misogyny is not a major theme of the book, but there are plenty of examples there in it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, the timing of the release, January 6th, very specific. Was that a huge portion? I mean, years ago, wish I'd re-listened before our conversation, but I had Stephen Hodkinson on the show to talk about the use of Sparta specifically in just generally white nationalist and alt-right circles, but I know he was looking really closely at January 6th. So not to say that I don't know anything about what he's done on it since then, but I more just mean how much did January 6th come into this? Obviously there was a lot of symbolism there. Or were you just kind of looking at the wider time period that you've been looking at with Pharos and everything?
Yeah, so Steve is a contributor to Pharos and a colleague and mentor to me over the years. And I'll just mention for your audience, if you're interested in Sparta and white nationalism. I, of course, say a lot in my book, but there's an open access book called Classical Controversies that has a lot of great articles in it. But Steve has a chapter on Sparta in there. That's a nice treatment. And there's another another chapter on Sparta by this German scholar Julia Müller in that book too. So that's open access.
Great.
If you Google Classical Controversies, Sidestone Press,
I feel like
you'll
I think he might have
and
mentioned
it's
it
worth
when
a
I.
read.
Yeah, that's great.
So January 6th, I mean, to me, January 6th was significant because it was the first really high profile demonstration of white nationalist classicism in this country. So to me, January 6th was significant because it was the first really high profile example of white nationalist classicism in this country. There were major events before that. The Charlottesville Unite the Right rally, I think, is a significant one.
Yeah.
There were plenty of classical symbols there. I think Identity Europa's recruitment on college campuses in 2017 and 2018, maybe that didn't reach the kind of national consciousness, but that touched a lot of communities.
What was that?
This was a white supremacist group that was recruiting on college campuses, terrorizing college campuses by posting flyers with white nationalist slogans in them. And some of these flyers had used images of classical statuary.
Oh, God.
So there'd be like a image of the Apollo Belvedere with the slogan "Protect Your Heritage." There's a famous sculpture of Heracles. I can't think of the
Farnese.
No, it's not the Farnese one. It's a different.
Farnese?
I was gonna say that,
Yeah,
but it's a different famous Heracles that they used. So some of those used classical sculptures, and they were on. I don't know. At one point I looked into it. I don't remember. I think it was they visited close to 50 campuses, major universities, and were flyering there. Not always with classical sculpture on their flyers, but those were definitely in their flyers. So that maybe, I consider that high profile in the sense that it touched a lot of communities. And when I get invited to speak at universities, more often than not, Identity Europa had visited that university, so I can refer to it. So those were some big things. But here's the Capitol riot. I mean, okay, the Unite the Right rally, that was a horrifying and terrible event. Actually, one of the men who marched with a shield, with a handmade shield with an image of the Roman Fasces on it, is the person who murdered Heather Heyer and injured 35 other people at the Unite the Right rally.
Wow.
So that's an important event. But I think that the attack on the U.S. Capitol was another level in terms of its national significance and its profile. And I think at that point, it becomes impossible to deny that the white nationalist fascination with Greco-Roman antiquity has real world consequences. So, at that attack, there were plenty of undeniable white supremacist symbols. Someone hung a noose on the Capitol lawn. There are pictures of people flying the Confederate flag inside the U.S. Capitol. And as I wrote about on my site, and actually young scholar Spencer McDaniel has a great post about it too that came out before mine. There were rioters who wore Spartan-style helmets in the attack, and there were people who flew flags with the phrase "Molon Labe," which I'm sure came up when you're talking to Steve Hodgkinson. The ancient slogan "Come and take them" that's been adopted by anti-government and pro-gun groups.
And I am always just required to say, even if it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but like the Persians did take them. I just can't fathom. Yeah, I know it doesn't mean anything anymore, but it's just so on its face silly.
Yeah. And there was another guy who had a big banner that said "Cross the Rubicon, President Trump." Referring to Julius Caesar's marching his army on Rome and establishing himself as dictator. So there were a bunch of classical symbols there too, in a site of real world violence on the, at the center of American politics, right? I think you could still, it was hard, but you could still write off the Unite the Right rally as like, okay, these are a bunch of anti-Semites and neo-fascists who got together, this like weird fringy thing. But I don't think it's possible to call an attack on the US Capitol trying to invalidate the democratic processes by which President Biden was elected a fringy thing. It showed us that, that kind of violence and willingness to engage in violence is a mainstream phenomenon, and it showed us that Greco-Roman antiquity is there. And again, if I could just circle back to this theme of respectability, it's kind of like the significance of Greco-Roman antiquity is the significance of Sparta there is, I think it's a leap for most people to attack the capital of their nation and try to subvert the democratic processes. How does someone convince themselves to go through with that? And the way they do it is they convince themselves that it is glorious, heroic, noble, and necessary. And Sparta, the symbolic landscape of Sparta, the way it's represented, I would say, in the ancient sources, undistorted, and the way it's been represented in historical work on Sparta. This is what Steve Hodkinson's book, the chapter I mentioned, is all about, is how actually, it's not all about, but it has a big section about how scholars have perpetuated this view of Sparta. Even those who criticize Sparta for its hypermasculinity, for its abuse of men, have sort of perpetuated the idea of it as a like military superstate. Anyway, if you've got a historical tradition that treats Sparta that way, if you've got ancient sources that treat Sparta that way, if across the United States there are high school sports teams called the Spartans, including
that was my high school. Even in Canada, like my high school
there
was
you
the
go.
Spartans,
right?
Yeah.
It's just a very admired symbol, and it's everything from a high school sports team to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who in one of the architects of the modern nation state as a concept, looked at Sparta as like, this is the place where, people were really committed to community, and that's the kind of citizenship we want to have. So the entire history of the interpretation of Sparta is one of basic admiration. And so it makes perfect sense that a certain number of people who want to see what they're doing as taking a heroic last stand to save their civilization from, illegitimate tyrannical ruler, that Sparta would inspire them, or that they would turn to Sparta to legitimize that violence. And so, the January 6th, that was the publisher's decision to have the book released on the 5th anniversary. Yeah. I love them for it.
I just realized it had been 5 years when I was looking at that date before our call. I feel like I blinked. But that's, and I mean, that's something that it's good. It's still being talked about 5 years later, even if it is specifically tying it to January 6th as that reminder of that, because I mean, as you said, it certainly wasn't, hidden in any way by the time that came around. And I just have to say, like, I don't have a question attached to this necessarily, but I hadn't thought about the kind of backdrop of it all too, the neoclassical buildings that they were, storming amongst all of this. That's not even intentional, but it's so deeply tied with just how deeply tied, the classical world is with not just white nationalism, but also like the foundations of very much, I mean, the states, and I think a lot of the sort of colonial North America generally.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a great article on that point, an online article at Hyperallergic by an art historian named Lyra Montero, called it's called "How a Trump Executive Order Aims to Set White Supremacy in Stone" on Hyperallergic. Maybe you could throw it in the show notes if you have such a thing.
Absolutely.
But what it's really about is the Capitol riot and the link between classical architecture as a backdrop to that and white supremacist activism. And it's one of, as I said at the beginning, the move I'm trying to make in my book, and Dr. Montero was way ahead of me in figuring this out. But the move I'm trying to make in my book is to show examples of what might be termed extremist action, whether it is the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville and the people chanting "Jews will not replace us" while carrying homemade shields with symbols of the Fasces on it, extremist action, or the January 6th riot even. What I'm trying to do in the book is lead people, as I have been led by examining this material, to realize how deeply rooted the way of thinking about the ancient world that we see in white nationalist circles is in our mainstream culture. And I think that classical architecture is a great example of that. So, you go to, as an American, you either go to Washington, D.C. on a school tour, or at the very least, you see images of it in school, and you learn to think of those buildings, the Capitol building, the classical columns of the Supreme Court, the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial. All of these are classicizing buildings. The Washington Memorial is an obelisk, which is sort of Egyptianizing, I would say, but I think it's imported from the sort of classical use of the obelisk.
Yeah, I was going to say that's the Roman obelisk.
Yeah,
I think.
you learn to think of that architectural style as integral to the identity of our nation as a democratic nation, as a all these like cliches of what America is as a nation of immigrants, a beacon of democracy, a revolutionary democracy. Any of those things. You learn to think of classical architecture as a symbol of the ideals of our nation. But it's actually kind of surprising that this colony in the quote unquote new world would have that architectural style. There's no link between this place and Greece and Rome, except one that's a fantasy, except one that was created by the people who decided that the symbolic landscape of this nation should be a classical one. And that choice to create a link between the new nation of the United States and that part of the ancient history of Europe is a settler colonialist move, because what it does is it denies and erases whatever history, whatever aesthetic principles, whatever civilizational elements were present here, and it replaces them with one that is imported in the name of creating this link, so that when we're taught, these sculpture or these buildings and this architectural style embodies the democratic principles, that's a distraction, that's a misdirection from the way that they also, and I would say more strongly, represent the like imposition of a white European model on what we now call North America. And that's how classics works in politics for the most part, is you have something that is so associated with ideals, whether it's the Enlightenment of ancient Athens, the Greek miracle, so-called, whether it's the rule of law in Rome and the Roman legal theory that is sometimes claimed to be foundational to modern law. All these kind of high-minded, admirable ideas that we say the ancient world represents makes the ancient world a very powerful tool to disguise violence and genocide and destruction and exploitation. And that's basically what I'm saying in the book white nationalists are doing, right? Is that they are like, well, we want to stop President Biden from being elected. Let's put on Spartan helmets and, make it look like a glorious and heroic act. Okay, maybe that's easy to poke holes in. But on the other side of that is the entire settler colonial project of this nation, which uses classics for exactly the same purpose, which is to turn attention away from violence and oppression and replace it with claims of high-minded political ideals. And by the way, that's why I don't make fun of Donald Trump's executive order, the latest one, making federal buildings beautiful again, because that executive order says, it begins by saying that the founders, in line with great societies before them, attached great importance to federal civic architecture. Fine. They wanted America's public buildings to inspire the American people and encourage civic virtue, right? It turns to this idea of like the buildings are connected to civic ideals. And they modeled the most important buildings on the classical architecture of ancient Athens and Rome. They sought to use classical architecture to visually connect our contemporary republic with the antecedents of democracy and classical antiquity. That's what his executive order says. And I think some people, when they read that, they'd be like, well, that's like Orwellian doublespeak here. How could the most authoritarian president in the history of this country be talking about antecedents of democracy and civic virtue? But all he's doing with that executive order, or the people who wrote it, all they're doing is talking about classical architecture in the completely normal American way of talking about classical architecture.
Yeah. Yeah, that could have been written 40 years ago and been one of the same things. Like, it's dumb in terms of just like, make it beautiful again. That's objectively stupid. But other than that, like, yeah, it sounds like actually an accurate description.
So I went on the,
yeah.
Let me read you something from the webpage of the Architect of the Capitol, which is a office. It basically says that because this is the sort of office that takes care of the National Mall and these monuments and everything. And it describes all the monuments as awe-inspiring facilities that comprise these monuments to American democracy that evoke the ideals that guided the nation's founders as they framed their new republic. That's the Architect of the Capitol. But you know what? That's not the Trump Architect of the Capitol. That's from the Obama Architect of the Capitol. So, that's just how we always talk about the architecture. And so when Trump writes his executive order mandating classical architecture and cites in the press release or whatever, this survey done by this group that is, rumored to be the ones that are pushing this executive order, the National Civic Arts Society, they did a survey that says that 72% of Americans, majorities across all political, ethnic, racial, socioeconomic, 72% of Americans prefer traditional architecture for federal buildings. I believe them. I don't think that's some faked right-wing poll. I actually think Americans do want classical architecture because we've been taught so strongly for our entire lives that this is representative of our national identity. And it's actually much more comfortable to believe that than it is to be like, these are symbols of the genocide of indigenous peoples and the settler colonial status of this country.
Well, and not to get too dark as a reaction to that, because I'm completely right, but like those two things are so tied too, right? Like those two things are unfortunately one and the same, not to the individual now's fault, but like I mean, it's the same for Canada, right? Our national identity is synonymous with the historical genocide of the indigenous people.
Yeah, 100%. So thank you for making that clarification. I think the point I'm just trying to make is that the classical, the prestige of the classical is the kind of mechanism by which that fact is effaced or disguised or distracted away from, such
well, it's really interesting.
that, you know, I see a real parallel between that kind of thing, which is happening in the dominant culture, and the way that white nationalists use the ancient world.
Yeah. I mean, I think about the classical architecture all the time, obviously, but it's always, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but it's also just the fact that they, you know, in that colonial style also got rid of all the color, or the color was already worn off, or whatever, for whatever reason. But it's also just so like painfully, you know, on the nose that all of these buildings are also considerably whiter than they would have been in the ancient world.
Yes, right. Yeah. Although, you know, my take on this is, can I say something about that? Because it's true, right? You know, both sculpture itself, like what Identity Europa used in the flyers that I discussed a little while ago. You know, they're representing the sculptures the way they appear in museums, as this like white marble, and they're doing it in support of white supremacy, seemingly unaware, or at least ignoring, that the sculptures were painted in antiquity. They wouldn't have looked like that, and that's true of a lot of the buildings too. You know, there's a lot of painting on the buildings, and you can find the pigments and everything. And so I'm not as you see that objection being made pretty often, especially for Identity Europa. This is why I think of them, is that there were the press around Identity Europa using classical sculpture, from classical scholars, and also in like kind of the art press. They pointed that out. They pointed out the polychromy, as we say. I never know how to say that word, but the colorful nature of these ancient sculptures. They pointed that out as a way of trying to weaken or criticize the use of those sculptures in support of white nationalist politics. And to some extent, it's true. So you can look at the history, at art history, and Johann Winkelmann, the father of art history, who, you know, sort of contributed to the fetishization of white marble. I think he wrote something like, the whiter it is, the more beautiful it is, or something about these sculptures. So, you know, there's this whole history of like whitewashing in quite a literal way, you know, even to the level of like sometimes removing the paint of whitewashing these sculptures. And it's very clearly connected to racial logics and everything. So bringing that up does challenge what Identity Europa is doing.
Yeah,
but on the point of my book, which is, sometimes I joke, the one sentence version of my thesis is, these people are smarter than you think. The people I'm interested in, they know that the ancient sculptures were painted. They're not trying to hide anything. They know they were painted, and they know that they were painted, at least the skin of the people was painted with a color that we would analyze as the skin color of white people, the modern racial logics were. Yeah. And so there's this like gleeful headline on this anti-immigration website that says, ancient sculptures weren't white, they were pink. And then, you know, is like making fun of making fun of people who think that the colored sculptures undermine the white supremacist use of them. And the reason I bring it up is because it points to how the problem is not something to do with Greco-Roman antiquity. The problem is that many, many people still assume or still accept the logics of racist pseudoscience, which claim, first of all, that race is a biological category, and that claim that the color of your skin, the genetics that produce your phenotype, that produce how you look, has any link to anything else about you. You know, white supremacist race pseudoscience says that the genetics that produce white skin also produce higher intelligence, greater courage, better morality, greater creativity, all these lies. Basically, there's no link. There's no link between the genetics that produce skin color. In fact, there's greater genetic variety among people who have the same skin color than there is between people with different skin colors. In any case, so that's a racist lie. This idea of race is a genetic reality. But as long as people believe that, I don't think the ancient sculpture, or let me put it positively. as long as people believe that racist lie, I think ancient sculpture does look like the art of white people. It does look like representations of white people. And
Oh,
I
yeah.
think Identity Europa understands this. That's why they, and that's why the people really know their ancient history in white nationalist circles. They don't mind that the sculptures are painted because they're painted in ways that most people would analyze. Oh yeah, that's a white person. These claims of ancestry are correct. But the claims of ancestry are never just about like, oh, I have the same genes that produce white skin as ancient people had. It's about everything else. I'm an inheritor of their superior intelligence, of their enlightened political philosophy, of their superior creativity, all these things that have no genetic basis, at least in connection to your skin color, and certainly not over many generations, right? Like, okay, maybe if your mom is really creative, you have a decent chance of being really creative yourself. But we're talking about genetic mixing
not 2,000
over
years
thousands
ago.
and thousands and thousands of years. There's a lot of mixing that takes place over that period. So, that I that's one point I make in the book, is that we're not going to be able to challenge white supremacy on the basis of antiquity. Antiquity, at least as it survives and has been curated by the dominant culture, I would say on balance, it actually probably does support white supremacist politics. The way we're going to challenge this is by challenging the belief in racist pseudoscience in our society. We're going to challenge it by challenging the belief that difference causes violence in our society. The way I actually organize the book is around 6 ideas that white nationalists use the ancient world to support. One of which is race is a biological reality. Another one is difference causes violence, and so on. Those are the ideas we need to challenge. There's a lot of what I show, or I hope I show, is there's a lot of ancient material that seems to support those ideas. And we're just not going to get very far by trying to say that antiquity doesn't support it. Instead, we got to be putting our efforts and our work into challenging those ideas, and then we can see what antiquity looks like and what it can mean once it's not being analyzed in a white supremacist milieu.
Yeah. Well, I'm thrilled to hear what that sort of end goal of it. I mean, that's something. Yeah, I try to talk on the show as often as possible just about the ways that all of that was very much still from the ancient world. We're not valorizing them here. I love Greek mythology, and also it's problematic as hell amongst all of the ancient history, and all of that. But it's such an interesting thing, and I have to say I don't think it's necessarily helpful to be like pointing out that statues were painted. I more think it's just like delightfully, I want to say ironic, but in the modern usage, not the literal usage of the word ironic, that the buildings are quite so much whiter than they would have been, but it's like, is that helpful? Absolutely not, because it's also the type of people who are, I don't know. I don't think necessarily critiquing like accuracy in those ways really benefits anybody, except just like you feeling like, oh, I'm smarter because I know the answer or whatever,
And sometimes I feel it's like, even if it's true and more accurate, if the entire history of interpretation and celebration of those monuments made them white, like, it's going to be hard to overcome that by the damage has been done.
Well, exactly. And I mean, it's like the damage on white supremacy and the way it has bled into the study of the ancient world, like that, it's done. We do have to like be more recognizing of those things. And it sounds like that's exactly what you're trying to do, is like establish that is not some fringe idea.
Right.
I think it's so important that, I mean, people in the field in any way are recognizing that these problematic things exist, because if you just pretend that people aren't using the ancient world in this way, and that the ancient world isn't so easily interpreted this way because it was, that it's so easy, I think, and so many, I think, parts of this world still do just put it up on this pedestal of like this untouchable greatness. I think about this because the new Odyssey movie is going to come out, and I don't know what I am not optimistic even in the tiniest bit, but it did get me a book, so it's fine. But you know, it's something that I think more and more we need to be recognizing these ties to those issues. And I mean, yeah, it's
the Christopher Nolan Odyssey movie is interesting to me because of what it sort of reveals about our society's fascination with ancient Greece and Rome. I think at the top of the show, I said the U.S. is a society where ancient Greece and Rome is pervasive, not just in white national circles, it's pervasive. And in a way, the Christopher Nolan movie, which is not even out yet, it's pretty far from coming out, but there was already press about it, years before, at least 2 years before it was going to be released. I remember seeing an article that's like, Christopher Nolan is making an Odyssey. And I was like, oh, I better put this on my calendar to see it. When's the release date? And it was 2 years in the future.
It was announced this time last year. I'm getting like all these flashback memories.
And I was, okay, Christopher Nolan's big name director, sure. But, short of like Star Wars or like a Lord of the Rings sequel, I was going to say a Marvel movie, but no, probably not a Marvel movie. Like what other like intellectual property, if we could use the term, gets press years before its release? Well, the classical does, because it's like seen as like, wow, this is really significant. Isn't it going to be interesting to see what this famous director does with this famous story?
With Matt
right.
Damon.
And so, this is the world the white nationalists are operating in. So of course they use ancient Greece and Rome. It's just ready-made for them, right? The ancient writers like Plato, Aristotle, Sallust, Juvenal, they're just full of white nationalist ideas. And so the white nationalists are looking at the US and other places where classics is held in high esteem. And they're like, here we have a society that admires and is fascinated by the ancient world. And it's a thing that lends itself really well to our politics. So of course they're gonna use it. Of course they're gonna exploit it.
Yeah. Well, and I'm kind of glad I brought up the Odyssey, because I'm going to be paying close attention to how that movie does kind of end up getting tied in with the white nationalist side of classics, because I think it'll be really easy. I mean, with a guy like Matt Damon in the role, like it's wacky. But yeah, and I think right now, it's more and more, I think they're sort of, that stuff is being done out loud in a way that it was kind of a little quieter before. It'll be interesting how that kind of shakes out. I mean, even if, alongside a Hollywood movie, but God.
Do you know this English scholar, Alexandra Sills?
Oh gosh, yes. Very well.
I just saw her give a great paper. If you haven't had her on her show, she's really good.
Many times. Yeah, no, we're friends.
Oh, okay. Yeah, good.
Yeah.
I just saw her give a great paper about sort of fan reactions to Gladiator 2.
Yeah.
And how the perceived wokeness, I hate to use that word, but the perceived wokeness of that film led many fans who had, loved the first Gladiator, which really lends itself to kind of white nationalist interpretations, right? The lone man maintaining civic virtue and integrity and honor amidst a degenerate empire, right? That's just like such a neo-fascist script. Anyway, Dr. Sills gave a great paper about how part of the bombing of Gladiator 2 was reactionary criticism of its perceived, which were not that strong, but its perceived wokeness, right? It was not that woke a movie.
No, it had like 2 women.
Yeah, right. So you gotta wonder if somebody like Christopher Nolan is thinking about that and is kind of like, well, I'm not going to take any risks. I want my movie to do well, so I'm gonna make a politically reactionary movie. We will see.
Oh, the Odyssey, though, of all the things, I just wish he'd taken anything else.
But the white nationalists love the Odyssey. They love the Odyssey
know.
because
Yeah.
they see it as the journey. They see Odysseus as the kind of like archetype of the white man surviving by his wits in a world of hostile foreigners and returning home to find his home full of outsiders and righteously murdering them and reinstalling himself where he should have been as king the whole time. And yeah, I mean, it's a disgusting reading of it, and yet it's not that far from the way the poem has usually been read, even to the point of the early colonizers of North America. They used the Polyphemus episode. You can find this in Christopher Columbus and other colonizers. They used the Polyphemus episode as a way of kind of predicting that they were going to find cannibals and savages on these islands as a way of justifying the extermination and enslavement of those people.
Yeah. Well, that episode is really overtly colonial, though. It's bizarre. I mean, disclosure, I have a children's book of the Odyssey coming out to time with the movie. That's why I joke. Amazing. I'm not looking forward to the movie, but I did get a book deal. And it's with a big publisher, so I'm kind of readying myself for the people who are angry that I did not write an Odysseus, anything like that. It's more of the lying liar of the actual Odyssey. But it's that point. It when he reaches the Cyclops, like there's this long and detailed thing about how they're like barbaric because they don't have the same laws and because they don't have the same family life. Like it's so overtly xenophobic that you're just like, yeah, of course, like this is, it's been in our culture since the beginning, even in something that is like otherwise pretty like decent as Homer.
Isn't there even a remark, something about how he didn't make good use of the land, like he wasn't practicing agriculture, like, right? Is all the things that the colonizers said about the indigenous people of North America. Like they're not really using the land well. So let's displace them and make good use of it. It's all there in the Polyphemus episode in the Odyssey.
Yeah, I didn't know the connection to Columbus, which is good to know and horrifying. But I've recently talked about how troubling that section is, because you're right, it goes into really specific detail about how they're not deserving of respect because they don't follow like all the exact same customs as the Greeks. It's interesting. I mean, I think it's so important to be sort of like always when we're talking about classics to be at least having that on in some part of the conversation or some kind of recognition of it, because I think the more that we pretend that it was this like totally different separate place where we just got all of the wonders of quote unquote Western civilization, the longer we treat it like that, the more we're not going to be learning from the mistakes we're already making, over and over again. Not to... Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. I'm really excited about that, the children's book of the Odyssey. I know you're going to do it right. You. So that's really cool.
We're towards the end of it, and I'm very proud of it. It's going to be really fun and like distinctly close to the original, but for like 8-year-olds. So
cool.
Yeah. But I mean, feel like we've covered so many things, but is there anything that, that you have in this book that we didn't get to talk about that you'd really like to mention? Not to put you on the spot either.
Yeah. I mean, I've tried to work in the main things I want to call attention to, about it. I mean, there's just so many more examples we could use. I think that I tried to include surprising things. I tried to include provocative things. Some people who have read advanced copies have told me they were surprised, for example, to find that the white nationalists do not like Alexander of Macedon, right? You would think that this military leader who conquered a vast empire would be a great model for them. And some of them, call him like the embodiment of Aryan dynamism and stuff like that. But in general, he's seen as like a globalizer. I
was gonna guess that he was like too gay, which is sad, but
they actually there's a, again, I mean, that's one thing I was kind of surprised to learn. I mean, it's controversial. It's a very homophobic movement, so there's like division around it. But the really scary people in white nationalist activism, I think they kind of understand like it's not helping us to be so homophobic. There's a lot of white gay people who actually might get on board with our politics if we spoke to them in a more open way. And one of the people arguing this, who has a PhD in philosophy, it points to Achilles and Patroclus. He points to Alexander, all these, sort of ancient men who had homoerotic relationships with other men. And he says, why shouldn't we, if Achilles and Alexander had sex with men, like, why shouldn't we welcome gay people into our movement? I don't know if this person's going to get anywhere with that that argument, but antiquity is there. So Alexander is seen as a kind of like person who, yes, he was a brilliant military commander, but that he like succumbed to race mixing, and in fact, created the cosmopolitan, degenerate, mongrelized empire, as they would see it. The first globalist is the view of Alexander. So that surprised me to find, and I include that in the book. Another thing, this is a little out of order, but going back to your question about the misogynist movements, one thing that emerges really strongly in the study of misogyny and Greco-Roman antiquity is the fascination with Roman Stoicism in misogynist communities, right? Because, and it's not a bad fit, because Roman Stoicism is a philosophical mode that views women as irrational and emotional, and it's a very heavily gendered view of like what a person should be like. They should be more like a man if they want to be happy. So Roman Stoicism fits that very well. But, the white nationalist activists are not interested in Roman Stoicism.
Really?
And in a sense, this is a example. And in fact, they're very critical of Roman Stoicism. And this is an example of how I sometimes think that the white nationalist activists, they see the ancient world maybe more clearly even than some professional scholars. Because unlike, I would say, the kind of even just the mainstream promoters of Roman Stoicism, the white nationalists understand the historical milieu in which Roman Stoicism emerged, which was in the cosmopolitan Roman Empire, when traditional hierarchies and structures were sort of fading away, and there was greater social mobility for people that were outside of the traditional aristocracy. And so they see Roman Stoicism as a kind of product of a cosmopolitan society that they do not like, that they think is actually a degenerate society. And so if Roman Stoicism is popular in the present age, they think that's a bad thing. They think that's a symptom of a society that has like lost its traditional structures, that has become too cosmopolitan, too diverse. And so they reject the popularity of Roman Stoicism, again, not from a kind of knee-jerk way, but from a position of deep understanding of where Roman Stoicism came from and why it was popular in the first place.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you think that's why obviously there's a lot of things that go into why Sparta is so important, but I feel like that anti-globalist absolutely fits in with that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, to them, Sparta, and to some extent Athens, I mean, this is maybe we don't have time to talk about this, but they love ancient Athens because it was a very xenophobic society, right? Pericles established it so that basically no outsider who didn't have two Athenian parents could ever become a citizen. And they subjected outsiders to a special tax and special surveillance by citizens and special legal penalties if they tried to participate in the civic life of the city. It was basically a city where any outsider, any foreigner, any immigrant was relegated to second-class status. And so the white nationalists can look at Athens and they say, see, relegating outsiders to second-class status and preventing them from ever obtaining citizenship is completely compatible with democratic institutions. This is the birthplace of democracy, they can say. But Sparta too, they look at Sparta and they see a model of the racially pure ethno-state, which they want to form, the opposite of the cosmopolitan Roman Empire or the Hellenistic empires. And yeah, definitely Sparta that's one of the big drivers of their interest in Sparta. It's not just the like hyper masculinity of the Spartan warrior. It's actually, I think, even much more. And again, this is all taken from ancient sources, which many people think are just a fantasy of Sparta, but it's there in the ancient sources. They're much more interested in the sort of xenophobia of Sparta, Lycurgus's prohibition against Spartans ever living abroad because they would become too luxurious. His prohibitions against foreigners spending the night in Sparta. You could maybe do business here, but you had to be gone by nightfall. There's a line, I think, in Xenophon where he says that they used to have just mass expulsions from Sparta periodically to get all the outsiders out. They find a powerful model for the way they think society should be organized in Sparta. And we can all day long be like, oh, the Spartans were loved by the Nazis and they murdered their slaves as a rite of passage and they traumatized their young men and they practiced slavery. And we can say that all day long. And the white nationalists are like, yeah, those are good things. Yeah. Right.
Well, their civilization also completely died out because they wouldn't expand their birth or their
that gets talked about less. That gets talked about less.
I would imagine. I'm really interested to hear that about Athens, though, because it very much fits the argument that you've been mentioning. Is just this that they know more than you kind of expect, because I feel like not that Athens would have been known as particularly metropolitan, but I would have assumed because it has, the arts and culture side of it, that it would have been less appealing. But them having such in-depth knowledge of the actual democratic principles of Pericles and everything, and being able to link back to that, that's very honest in a way that I feel like people rarely talk about Athens, even deeper in classical circles.
Right. And the art and culture allows them to say, and see, this xenophobic society had all the most beautiful art and great philosophy and everything. So don't we want to have all of that? Maybe we should be more like Athens.
Yeah. Wow. Well, there's these little posters up in my neighborhood, and literally always, at least for the last year, promoting philosophy. And they always have a statue of Marcus Aurelius, and I am perpetually terrified of those, but now at least I know that they're probably not also white nationalist. They're just
they might only be misogynist
philosophers. So I guess we've got it's 50% less terrifying.
Hey, Liv, we gotta find hope where we can in 2025.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Oh my God. No, I'm interested. Those examples are fascinating. It's just all so dark. Everything's so I wanted to say delightfully dark just to make it sound happier. But it's not particularly delightful. Well, this has been really interesting. Thank you so much.
I wish I could tell your listeners to buy my book for a fun summer read or as a great gift for your uncle.
It might be.
It's not
meant. Needs to learn.
If your uncle is in a place where they want to do that kind of reflection about the way they think about ancient history and what it tells them about themselves, then by all means give it to them. But I do think it's a really there's a lot of surprises, a lot of twists and turns. At least I tried to put them in. So I hope people will give it a look. It's available wherever you buy your books. And I would love to hear from anybody who gives it a read and wants to talk about it more.
Well, you just kind of jumped ahead, which is great, but I'll put links in the episode's description. Is there anything else you want, websites you want to mention, or where people can follow you anywhere?
Yeah, sure. I'm on Blue Sky, Curtis Dozier on Blue Sky. And of course, check out my website, Pharos, Doing Justice to the Classics at pharosclassics.org. I've been posting less there because I've been working on this book. But I have just written something about, I've got a couple posts about Elon Musk. I just wrote something about Megyn Kelly, who's a very significant newscaster here. She referred to the Roman Empire in a recent publication. Probably by the time this comes out, I hope I've got an article there about the giant sculpture of Prometheus that this tech bro has proposed building in San Francisco.
Oh my God, who? I probably won't know him, but
Yeah, he's not known except for this. His name is Ross Calvin.
What a loser.
Yeah, and it's very clear. You can read his site. It's very clear that he sees this as a white nationalist project. And now I've got a section in my book about Prometheus as a symbol of white supremacy, as the kind of like embodiment of the claimed embodiment of the like unique creativity and dynamism of white people. So check out my site. You know, I'm just, to be honest, I hate to say this, I wish it wasn't true, but I'm just drowning in material. So I hope I'll be able to get some more examples of this up on the site. And there are links to find the book there too, if you want. So follow me on Blue Sky, take a look at my website at ferrisclassics.org. And I'd love to see you out there.
No, thank you so much. You did mention myth though, and now I'm like, well, why wasn't I asking about myth? But I always assume like I'm just thinking about history and the reception. But it's okay, Prometheus, of course, that's so yucky. So before I let you go, have they latched onto any other, like, I mean, Prometheus feels very like, okay, like gross but expected.
Mm-hmm.
But now I mean, even just for my own personal edification, because sometimes I don't know things about how mythological characters have been sort of transformed by the zeitgeist. But now I'm curious.
Yeah, right. No, wait. Actually, when I was preparing for this, I was like, I need to think about the myths they use, and then we.
No, I know.
So one thing I'll say, for a while on my site, I was trying to create sort of teaching materials for teachers who might like to incorporate some of what I'm doing on the site into their classes. And there's a sidebar on the site, teaching resources. If you click on teaching resources on ferrisclassics.org, there's a couple kind of selections of readings. And one of them is for Greek myth. So there's some examples there that you or your readers can find. Prometheus is one. The Odyssey is a big one. We did talk about that. They're very interested in Achilles, also in the Homeric Iliad. One thing that kind of surprised me is that there's not a ton of interest in Heracles.
Interesting.
And I will admit, here's a little behind the scenes thing you can probably relate as a book author. It wasn't until pretty late in the game that I working on the book that I realized that it sort of dawned on me. Wait, no one's saying anything about Heracles.
Yeah.
You know, it's like you can't see what's not there
until suddenly you're like,
until you step back a little bit. I was like, it might have even been when it wasn't at the point where I was making the index, but I think I was kind of like thinking about the index. I was like, wait, there's not going to be an entry for Heracles. Who's a pretty major mythological figure. But so I dug around a little bit. There's a few references that I could find. And what it seems to me is that Heracles doesn't suit their politics very well because he was such an individual. He wasn't doing things for a community. Now, that he was an individual. He sort of left this trail of destruction in his wake. So that's in a way a kind of thing that surprised me too, was that Heracles didn't figure more significantly for them. But I sort of gathered that if what they're trying to say is that white people need to bond together and, be proud of their identity and create like white communities to survive in a hostile world, Heracles doesn't fit that model very well. Like the stories of Heracles don't fit that. So again, they care a ton about ancient Greece and Rome, but they only care about it insofar as it supports their politics. And so if something doesn't suit them, they just, don't say very much about it.
Yeah. That's how they're nowhere, it's so disconnected from the ancient world, because Heracles was it. Like, it's so obviously, picking and choosing what fits their disgusting narrative. And
and I'm glad you said picking and choosing, because if we want to insist, or if we're committed to the view that they are distorting history, the way we can say they're distorting it is that they're picking and choosing, and that they're curating a view of antiquity, right? They leave out Heracles, but they leave out a ton more. They leave out all the work that's been done on marginalized voices, the experiences of women, the experience of enslaved people, right? They don't say anything about that. Many of those that would, complicate their view. They don't say anything about the the Hellenistic philosopher which is recorded in Josephus, I think, who said that actually the Jews and the Spartans have the same ancestor. There's like an
they didn't like that.
There's an ancient claim about that, right? You don't find that find that on white nationalist sources. They leave that out. So you can say they're curating antiquity, but the flip side to that, which I keep coming back to, is it's the same curation that the dominant approaches to
I was gonna
Greco-Roman
say,
antiquity do, right?
Yeah.
Most of the history of the study of the ancient world has left out women and marginalized voices.
Oh yeah. My degree's not even 15 years old, and I didn't have any classes available.
Most professional classical scholars don't know that there's a fragmentary author who said that the Jews and the Spartans have the same ancestor. We're just we're not taught those things. And so yes, they're curating it, but it's a curation that is perpetuated by mainstream approaches to the ancient world also.
Yeah.
And so that again and again in the book, if I could name one kind of theme, is I kept coming back to this feeling as I was researching this material that what I thought was fringy and provocative and misappropriation and abusive, the harder I looked at it, the more I kept seeing similarities and entanglements with what was familiar to me as a classical scholar.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you were emphasize that point again, because I think that is, obviously the point of your book, but also really important in the grand scheme of this world, studying the classics and just generally being aware of it. It's important to remember they're not just making stuff up or changing things. They're just picking out the stuff that was there and maybe leaving out some other stuff. But it's now I'm having trouble wrapping up because it's so dark again, but also I'm so fascinated by this, and I am always, I'm very paying way too much attention to the news and everything that's happening. And so it's, I don't know. It's nice to chat with somebody else about it, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Definitely,
so
definitely.
Thank you so much.
And that's really what it's about. Is if you are wondering, this is one thing I felt when I launched the site, because it wasn't to change the minds of the white supremacists, but it's kind of like, if you're wondering, if you feel uncomfortable, you listener or person out there, if you feel uncomfortable with the political entanglements of ancient Greece and Rome, but you also find yourself drawn to ancient Greece and Rome, which is a totally normal thing to feel, right? When it's so pervasive in our country, and there is so much fascinating about it. If you feel drawn and you're uncomfortable with the political entanglements, know that you are not alone. You already know that if you found this show, but
I was going to say, I've been doing this for 8 years in different ways, but definitely I'm happy to have more forms of it.
That I think is the way that the work is not dark, is that it's, it's very dark, but it's like truth telling, right? And truth telling is a form of bringing light to things, if I can continue the metaphor, and being critical in this way, I think is actually a form of love for the material. So so it's great that you're doing that on the show, and it's great that your listeners are interested in that, and I'm very honored to be able to be here and share the way I'm approaching that with all of you.
Well, I'm so grateful to have you. Thank you again. This has been absolutely fascinating.
Thanks, Liv.
Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by Liv Albert, who is tired. I don't know. I'm sick. It's the beginning of January, but she better be having a good time out there. Anyways, Michaela Panguish is the Hermes to all your Olympians. The producer does other stuff. Don't know what else right now. Select music by Luke Chaos. Thank you, Mr. Chaos. The podcast is part of the Memory Collective Podcast Network, a collection of creators that all strive to bring you accurate and reliable information on the ancient world. These include the wonderful friends at Movies We Dig, the partial historians, Sweet Bitter, and so much more. Get ad-free episodes and more by subscription to the Oracle Edition on Patreon at patreon.com/mythsbaby or via the link in the episode's description. We do lots of stuff over there on Patreon. so much in the last week. We were both taking a break and disassociating into the distance as people with ADHD sometimes do. Anyways, if you are a scholar or someone in the field, we would absolutely love to have you on the show. Please visit the website, www.mythsbaby.com, to find our contact form. We want to talk to you. We sure would love to have you on the show. Drop us a call, drop us a note. Anyways, that's all for now. See you on Friday. Bye-bye.